Hey, everybody. Nathan Jacobs with the Nathan Jacobs Podcast here with you. Those of you who follow my channel regularly, you notice that we've moved to this new format, which I had promised about doing these more concise videos, things that are more in the 25 to 45-minute range. And we've been dropping those every Thursday. But as promised, I said we weren't going to completely stop doing the long-form content. So here, on this Tuesday, we're going to be going ahead and dropping an interview, a longer-form interview. So those of you who have looked at past interviews, you might remember a character that I talked to named Chris Firestone, Dr. Chris Firestone. And if you haven't heard of him or watched that old interview, which we can link to below, Chris is originally a former philosophy professor of mine and then turned colleague. We ended up teaching together after I had finished my PhD. And in addition to that, we've worked on co-authored essays, we've done co-authored books, co-edited books. And so Chris is a long-term friend, a long-term mentor, a long-term colleague in the area of philosophy. And Chris happened to be driving through Nashville. He had planned actually to come to Nashville in order to get some time with me. He'd figured out that I'm a busy guy, and if you want to get an interview with me, you might have to actually just physically show up and corner me. And so Chris decided to do that. And so today, what we're going to be looking at is we're going to be looking at one of those interviews. Now, Chris is a guy who's all about the journey. And so what he originally wanted to interview me about was about my journey in three areas, really. Three areas that he watched me go through. One of those areas is my academic journey, becoming a scholar. The other one is my journey in spirituality that ultimately led me to Eastern Orthodoxy. And the third thing is he watched me on my journey as an artist and how you move from me being a fine arts painter, drawer guy into being a filmmaker. And so that was Chris's original plan, and that occupies the first two of the interviews that we did. The third one was kind of unexpected. Chris is a Protestant evangelical, and so he wanted to have a dialogue about really the relationship between various Christian traditions and the church, or at least my perspective on that sort of thing as an Eastern Orthodox Christian and what that means in terms of religious dialogue. So that ended up being the third interview within this series. And so with that, let's jump into part two of our three-part interview with Dr. Chris Firestone. I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast.
And I'm Dr. Chris Firestone of the Firestone Files.
It's coming at you right now. Enjoy.
All right. Well, welcome back to the Firestone Files in cooperation with
the Nathan Jacobs Podcast.
Super excited to be here in Nashville at Nathan's house, letting me set up this this ad hoc real estate here in terms of a set and interview him. And I just being with you for a day, I see how busy your life is. And so it's what an honor it is just to be here and be able to hang out and do this with you. So
glad you could be here.
We are talking about our really your journey. And in a previous episode, we talked about our friendship and some of the things we went through and some of the academic stuff.
Oh, yeah.
There are other podcasts on that, but we talked about a lot of things we hadn't talked about before on camera anyway.
Mm-hmm.
This time, I would like to do a little deeper dive in your spiritual journey.
Okay.
But using the pathway of your artistic journey as kind of the arc or the driving force for the whole thing. And so I'd like to start there in the artistic stuff, and then maybe you can help me understand, some of the spiritual stuff as well as we go along.
That's an interesting angle. Yeah, no, I like that. Okay.
Well, the reason is because when I think of our relationship, first time I met you, you didn't wear it on your sleeve, but you told the story of being a transfer student from
Oh, yeah.
this unusual place that I'd not heard of, but a lot of people have who are in the art world. I'm not in the art world. I was an academic who had been buried in the academy for a long time. But this Maryland Institute of Art?
College of Art, MICA.
College of Art, MICA. And so I want to start there, if you will. I mean, maybe we could start in your youth, but how you got there.
Sure.
And what happened there that then led you back into the academy.
Sure. Okay, that's an interesting way in. And I'll just say before I jump into it, you weren't the only person who I think was intrigued by that question of what is a proper artist doing, like suddenly jumping into philosophy and religion. So I remember even in my doctoral studies, Richard Muller, who was my doctor father, right? In working in historical theology, on post-Reformation scholasticism, on Leibniz, Richard was world-renowned in terms of, he is world-renowned in terms of, I mean, I'd say he's probably the foremost authority in the world on 16th, 17th century, post-Reformation scholasticism. And so people came from all over the world to study with Richard.
Yes.
And it was interesting because I had been told explicitly going to Calvin that, look, if you're not just a pure, straight up, I'm a historical theologian just doing textual analysis, you're doing the sort of creative, constructive philosophy of religion stuff in dialogue with the history of ideas, there's no world where Richard works with you. And yet that turned out to be false. And, one of the interesting things about it was the thing that first excited Richard about me was the fact that I was an artist, because Richard was moving toward the later years of his career. He was getting ready to retire. And one of the things he had gotten into was painting. And he had a background in it, but Richard was also very classical in his orientation to painting. So he was doing glaze painting, underpainting, all these sorts of things. And so I remember in our research methodology class, one of the first things he gave us was, I think it was, it was an essay by Sir Joshua Reynolds, who is the president of the Royal Academy and of Art. And he was doing this as sort of an example about like knowing historical context. And there was some oddities in there where he's like, so what do you think this means? I just go, I know what this means. He's like, well, you went to art school, so you're not allowed to answer this question. And so, but that started this. I showed Richard my portfolio. He started showing me his art. And so we really, started this relationship built around art. It's actually one of the reasons why when they did the volume dedicated to Richard, my contribution was an essay on the Platonism of Sir Joshua Reynolds, and sort of bucking the common wisdom that he's not a Platonist or that's an older reading or whatever. But that was really just in honor of the fact that I knew, like, right out of the gate, day one, this legendary scholar, I'm in his historical, methodology class, and we had never met. And the thing that gets his attention is I'm an artist.
Yeah. Well, that is a deep and a profound relationship. You supervised your PhD, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And, but you had the same reaction at Trinity as I recall.
I know.
And it played out slightly differently in a couple of different ways. Let me use one example of that as we kind of back up just a little bit from the PhD back to the undergrad, was that you ended up getting, wasn't it 2 majors out of this? Because we went in to Steve Pointer and to the academic board there and basically argued that your art background should be a humanities degree.
Well, I mean, essentially what it was, I mean, I left art school in my 3rd year. And so we're sort of getting ahead of the story. We'll go back into all this, I'm sure. But I left art school in my 3rd year. And in art school, for anybody who's never been, like, it's not like when you go to a liberal arts college and you're an art major, where you're taking 5 classes and maybe 2 are art, right?
It's like history of art or something like that.
This is, all of your classes are art. 100% of your classes
sketching,
are art.
painting.
And even in art school, one of the wild things, because this was such a weird thing for me once I transferred to Trinity, because art is so labor intensive, time intensive, for every credit hour you receive, you're in class for 2 hours. And so if you take a 3 credit hour class, you're in there for 6 hours, and it's 6 hours at a time, right? So you'll take the class 1 day a week and you'll show up to paint for
Right.
6 hours for your 3 credit hour class.
Yes.
And so when I got to Trinity and I was like, I'm taking a 3 credit hour class, we're taking 3 sessions a week and we're not even doing the full range. It's like 50 minutes in and we're done. I was like, what? Class is over. I just sat down. What is this? Anyway, I think it was Steve Pointer who recognized, he was like, look, I looked at his transcript. He looked at my grades. He was the one who put me in the honors program right out of the gate when I was first transferring in. But he was the one who looked at that and was like, you've done more than enough credits for an art major in a liberal arts context.
Yes.
I realized in art school, you would still have like a year and a half of classes to do. But in terms of like a liberal arts school, you've more than completed a major in this discipline. And that's why Richard, I think it was in you and I and Steve, I remember a committee meeting or something that I got pulled into as an undergrad on this. The number of committee meetings I got pulled into was weird, but it was this entire controversy question over saying like, we don't have an art major. What can we do? And my recollection is they said like, we have a humanities major. And so we could do like a humanities emphasis in fine art to just try to acknowledge this.
Yes.
Something like that.
Yeah, I think we were pretty delighted with that outcome. And it's, again, having a great administrator like Steve Pointer made that possible, because in that meeting, he kind of turned the lever there and really helped us get over the hurdle.
Yeah.
Say, honor that art background with the humanities.
It's also part of why Trinity gave me a full ride to the divinity school. Well, I'm sure we'll get to that.
That story is a great one. I'm looking forward to talking a little bit about that. One thing I realized, though, as you were talking about your time in art school, in the immense amount of time of concentration and classroom time and focus that you had, that really, in some ways, prepared you for the academy later on, in the sense that if you're going to do good work in the academy, you're going to be pouring into books, writing papers, and really diving in. In my own journey, I didn't go to art school or anything like that. I played chess in high school, and I learned in order to be a state championship chess player, you have to spend hours focused on this dream. And so did that come into play?
Well, no, I mean 100%. I would say one of the reasons, even though for you as somebody who had seen normal academia,
right,
our relationship probably seemed weird, right? Like, I mean, in a good way, but like. But for me, that's what you do, right? I'm a philosophy major. Of course, I'm with the philosophy professors and the philosophy majors and hammering this stuff out all the time. And all this other stuff is just white noise, right? Like,
I hadn't thought of that until this moment, actually, that there was a bridge there between what you'd experienced
and the fact that you're striving to find your voice and figure these things out and going through that whole slog. I mean, so the whole idea that you would be a major in something, but it's just one of 5 things you're studying at that moment or what, that didn't even register with me.
Yes, I remember that, because you were so focused in on doing the philosophy thing that you occasionally ran into those like traditional professors who said, no, you need to do my thing, not whatever question interests you.
That's right. Yeah. Well, and it was actually, that was always part of the thing. Like I had fine grades, like in other classes, but I would always let those classes slip. And it would be like, I just accept. I'm like, I'm not here to study that. I mean, I'll do it because I got to do it, but
I always had to run like a screen for you and a few others like you who were like,
I created problems for myself, and that's why all of a sudden you get to the PhD where I get to do nothing but the stuff I care about. All of a sudden it's straight A's, right? But it was, but yeah, I mean, I wasn't there for the grade. I wasn't there for the academic side of things. It wasn't for the paper. It was for the journey, which had to do with philosophy and religion, like we talked about last time. But
I do want to dig backward a little bit more, but I still, while we're in the transitional world that was your college experience, you didn't stop doing art there. As I recall,
no, I still had
private various locations that you were setting up in people's garages. And
I think I was painting in Bill Mulder's basement. I had different people who were purchasing artwork. I had a wealthy sort of private patron in the area that was commissioned me for stuff. Anyway, so I still did stuff on the side there for that. But yeah, I mean, I guess going back to your original question, like a lot of people who go to art school, they have, they always loved art. They don't pay attention in class. They're always spending time drawing. That's the thing they love. And it becomes the battle of whether or not you can convince your parents to study art, because parents have this notion that the starving artist, you won't be able to get a job. And ironically, all of my jobs in the interim while trying to get a PhD were art jobs. So like that's actually not true. Art is actually today, it's actually a really useful skill set if you can apply it in a commercial context and so on. But anyway, my brother had already gone to art school, so he had already fought the battle. He went to the Center for Creative Studies in Detroit, and that was Kevin. And so he had already fought that battle and won. And so my parents were already accustomed to it. And they always knew, like, Nathan doesn't pay attention to anything. His head's in the clouds all the time, except for our art. Like, there was no fighting that battle. And so me going off to art school was like a no-brainer for them.
Right.
But in terms of like how it relates to the spiritual journey, I would say a couple of different things, which are I find interesting anyway. So one of the things I did, I tell this story a lot. I oftentimes will say that my spiritual journey was sparked by a bad acid trip, and that's true. But that the LSD and the fact that I loved, the drugs that I did, the hallucinogens I did not for pure hedonistic pleasure. I did them. I mean, there was part of that, right? There was part of, I'm sure I had all sorts of, things I was trying to numb and whatever else. But there was a big part of it also that was just, I loved the way it allowed me to do it. Well, a few different things. One is that when you're an artist, and this is, I'm sure, true of essay writing or whatever, you're so close to the thing that you're doing. It's hard for you to see it with the fresh eyes that other people, like no filmmaker gets to watch their movie for the first time. They don't, right? Because you've been in the trenches, all the dirty laundry, how the sausage was made, all that sort of stuff. But drugs allowed me an opportunity to put on new lenses and kind of see my artwork with fresh eyes, which was something I really enjoyed. Because there was something about art that what I saw it as is the outward articulation, the artifact of something that's inside of you. You've been cultivating this skill set, and that manifest artifact is the concrete incarnation of the skill set you've been developing. And so to sit there and be like, yeah, that came out of me, was something that was very satisfying.
Yes.
And so drugs were always part of that. And then also with that, certain drugs like LSD in particular were particularly alluring because they really changed the way you think. And all of a sudden, a lot of inhibitions and boundaries you will run up against in your own creativity started to fall away. For example, and this is probably more detail than people want to know about LSD, but I remember my first LSD trip. One of the things that I did was, once it was really kicking in and I was tripping balls, to use the word on the street term, I was like, I got to draw. And we were in lockdown in a house. A bunch of us were on LSD, all artists. And I remember just looking around, like in this, candlelit Tom Petty's playing, lava lamps, whatever else going on. And I'm looking around. The first thing I see to draw with is I grab this big, fat, red magic marker. Not the sort of tool you would ever think, like, yeah, I want to do some art, right? But I grab that, and then I see poster board, right? So this big piece of poster board, and I just rip off a piece, and I slap it down. Now, again, when I say rip it off, it's some awkward, wonky shape that, again, like I would typically think rectangle, square, right? But here it's like, who cares what shape it is? And then I slap my head down on the table, and rather than looking at it like this, I'm looking at it like this. And I all of a sudden realized, as an artist, I can warp space however I want. It doesn't have to be one point perspective. And all of a sudden I started doing drawing after drawing after drawing, unlike anything I'd ever done, because I was like, oh, I can arc, I can do fisheye drawing. And I didn't have the typical hangups of whether that line's perfect and all that. And that was the sort of thing that I really liked about LSD. That's why I did it, because it opened up my horizons artistically. And I was like, that's crazy, right? Like that's wild that, looking at, that all of a sudden these constraints that I'm not even attuned to are there, like that it has to be a rectangle, just fall away. And all of a sudden you realize, oh, I can do a lot of other things. So that's why I did it. That's why I liked it. But the fateful moment for me was the bad LSD trip. And so one of the things about acid or LSD is that once it kicks in, you're on that ride, right? There's no sobering up, and so you better like it, because it's going to last for hours. It could be 6-8 hours, right? You're going to be tripping. And so it's like stepping into a roller coaster. And rather than I've just got to hang on for 2 minutes before it's over, it's like it's 8 hours. So you better enjoy the ride, because you're on it whether you like it or not, which is a terrifying gamble, right? And so I had an LSD trip that went wrong. And this was the fateful moment of awakening for me. And that awakening was just that, I was having all sorts of oversensory type stuff, and I wanted it to stop. And in that moment, I was like, how do I make this stop? And the next thought wasn't despair. It wasn't suicidality. It was just like the way, oh, I don't have to draw in rectangles. The thought was beyond what you would typically think. Your normal inhibition's lower. And I thought, oh, I could kill myself. And it wasn't despair. It was just your thought horizon has expanded in ways where you consider things you typically wouldn't consider. And so all of a sudden I'm sitting there going, I could kill myself. I ingested a chemical. I guess if I put a bullet through my brain, like that would stop it. Right. And then immediately after that, a second thought followed on that. Now, I like to believe that thought was introduced by someone, maybe Socrates himself, but a thought follows where it says, well, you could do that self. I have a conversation with myself in this moment. I was like, I could kill myself. And it's like, yeah, you could, but you do realize that consciousness is not a physical object. So are you sure that if you kill the physical object it's attached to, that it'll stop? And I was like, oh, that's a good thought, self. I don't know if that's true. And then all of a sudden, the next thought was, what if it didn't? Like right now, the terror I'm experiencing is in my mind.
Could be eternal.
And if my body dies, but my mind stays in this state, that would be hell. And for that was the first time for me, the afterlife made sense.
Right.
The idea that the mind isn't a physical object. Consciousness is attached to a physical object, but it's not a physical object. And just because the body dies doesn't mean that stops. And if the mind is in a state of misery and terror, maybe that endures, and that's what the religious people would call hell. And that revelation gripped me. Like I was just like rocked by that.
Early or late in the?
So believe it or not,
I presume it'd be late, but
this is, believe it or not,
experience.
This is like senior year of high school, right before I go to art school.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So I go to art school in existential crisis, but I'll get back to that. So the first thing I do after I have that realization, there was a second thing about that trip. We had been playing with different auditory delays and things like that had created, like burned into my head, this like sense of ticking time.
Yes.
And so in that moment, as I had that realization, I had this sense of each tick, I'm one step closer to death. And so you put those two things together, I'm losing my mind. I'm like, I've got to answer this question right now. And I do something very inadvisable. I get in my car and I drive home, which is, thank God I didn't kill anybody, including myself. But I get home and I go and I'm like, I need a Bible. Because, where are you going to start with the religious question? I grab this Bible and I just literally drop it open in order to read. And it's really hard to read on LSD, by the way. But my eyes land on this one sentence, and it grips me at how to the point it is, right? That I never get past that one sentence for the next 3 hours until I sober. which is it was Christ in the Sermon on the Mount saying, if your right eye causes you offense, gouge it out and cast it away, because it's better to enter life maimed than to be cast whole into hellfire. And I was like,
that scared more than one person.
It's a little on point. and that started a really neurotic in the sense of obsessive compulsive, like an obsessive pursuit of philosophy and religion questions. Now that started all at art school, right? Well, it actually started before that. In high school, all of a sudden I started down that road. In art school, it continued down that road. So it was me reading the Bible.
So going to art school is more of a passion play than it was an intellectual journey.
Yeah. Now the irony is that journey, the existential journey, disrupted the art, because what happened was I was so obsessively reading, apologists, comparative religion, philosophy, as far as I could. I mean, I didn't know how to navigate these things, but I started to discover, there are books on these topics.
Right.
And so I was reading systematic theology. I was reading apologists. I was reading philosophy. I was reading all sorts of different things. And it was all very haphazard, right? Like I didn't know what I was doing. It was just wherever I could find a book that was relevant, I'd read it. But I was doing it to the neglect of my art studies. So I'd go into an art class, like a church or like an art history class, and I'm smuggling in like a volume of something and I'm reading in the dark, this thing. And, when I had, time between classes where I should be painting, I'm studying. And so the irony was I really started to neglect my art at art school. I grew a lot because inevitably you're still in class for 6 hours painting, but I was way more interested in what was going on and solving these questions.
So what, you said 2 or is it 2.5 years?
2.5, yeah. It was in my 3rd year that I left.
What's the trigger that says I got to get out of this and get into the...
It's always a woman, Chris. No. I mean, that's true. There was some, basically there was some personal things happening, and I really kind of used that as leverage to convince my parents that I should leave and go to a different school where I can study philosophy.
All right. Okay.
And so,
well, that's where I pick up the story.
That is where you pick up the story. Yeah.
You drop in there. Now, I do recall your early interest. Maybe this is the difference between, milk and solid food, but you were interested in evangelical theologians at the time. And that's one of the reasons you came. I remember people like Wayne Grudem. I don't know if it was Van Hooser as much as it was, because they had straightforward answers to questions.
Yeah, at least they were taking the text seriously. That was always one of the things. Like I wasn't sympathetic because I was taking the question seriously.
Right.
When I would encounter somebody who's sort of a liberal Bible scholar who just doesn't believe any of this stuff, but we're just treating the text, I'm like, well, why am I even talking to you? Like, if you don't believe this stuff, what are we doing here? And so that's one of the reasons why I was drawn to. This is one of the reasons why, even though, as you know, I tended to distance myself from apologists,
right,
I still at least liked that an apologist took a stance.
Right.
And he's trying to convince me. I was like, good. Convince me, right? And it was actually interesting because one of my early immediate reactions and frustrations really was that once I took these things seriously, I was really frustrated by how few other people took them seriously. So I remember going and sitting down with a Lutheran pastor because my mom, was a Lutheran. And so she was like, well, why don't you talk to Pastor so-and-so?
Right.
And I got in there and I was like, unloading on this guy. Like, I need answers. And I remember him being like, Nathan, are you on drugs? And I was like, no, I do a lot of drugs, but at this moment I'm not on drugs. But the thing that bothered me about it was I was like, do you not see the seriousness of this question? This is your whole job. Did you not get into this gig because you thought it mattered? Because again, what are we doing here?
Right.
And so the thing that I always ran into is what I cared about was people who at least took a strong position. And that was one of the reasons why a lot of the people I found were in a Protestant or evangelical world, because it was like, okay, at least you're you believe this and you're willing to stake a claim and you're willing to argue for it. And so in my digging around in different areas, oftentimes my research would end up bringing me to some, Protestant,
Right.
apologist, or just a Protestant Bible scholar, or Protestant systematic theologian, or whatever, because at least they were staking claims.
Okay. Now, before jumping into a little bit more into your undergraduate years in the art sort of arc there, I remember you saying something to me that stuck with me, and tell me if this funds into this at
I have
all.
no idea what you're going to say.
I know.
That's great.
It's you talked about. I think we were looking at some contemporary art or something, and you weren't convinced with some of the art that you were seeing. You said, I'm not convinced that they've done the hard work of the sketching and of the fine arts training.
I'm sure I said it much more
purposely. Yeah, it was
contentiously.
What stuck with me was, that seems right to me. There's a critique here. I'm not saying that every contemporary artist, modern artist doesn't have those skills, but there's some kind of rite of passage you have to go through in the art world.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that your time in Maryland was developing those skills, the realization that you needed to have those skills in order to do the harder stuff.
Yeah. So this has actually always been part of my philosophy of art. I didn't have the vocabulary. A lot of the things in my journey, I would say, I intuited something that I would still say today, but I didn't have the vocabulary or the framework to articulate it yet. Right. And so one of the things that happened at art school, and I would actually say things like this, we'd be sitting there and we'd be looking at, usually oftentimes in art school, like the Art Institute of Chicago, there's an appended museum, right, where they have, museum pieces. And so I remember us being in a gallery, because that's sometimes what you do in your art class. We're going to take a break. We're going to go over to the gallery. We're going to look at some pieces. We're going to talk about them. And I remember going, when I first saw this piece, I still remember this one. I'm sitting there and I'm looking at this very sort of ethereal, sort of hazy, washy painting. And then there's a few places where figures sort of come into view, like almost through mist. I'm like, when I first saw this, I wasn't convinced that this guy had the right to do this. And the professor's like, the right to do this? So tell me more, right? Now he's intrigued, right?
Right.
But I start to talk about exactly, and I don't know how I would have phrased it at the time.
Right.
But I basically talked about the fact that, and this is still essential to my view of art. Art, the term itself, refers to a skill, right? And with someone like, let's use an Aristotelian framework, where you are a bundle of potentialities, right? There is ontological potential. You have strength, potential strength within you, which is less than actual strength, but it's more than nothing, right? And you have the potential to be musical, to be poetic, whatever it might be. And then through repetition, habit, the sort of rigors that start to form those things, just like the rigors of working out, that potential moves into a concrete actuality. And so art, when I think of the word art, I don't actually think of the artifact that you're looking at.
Yes.
I think of the cultivated skill. So I have that art within me of drawing and painting. And I have potential for more of that if I do further rigor, but I have a certain cultivated reality of art within me. And when I engage in the production of artwork, right, then what emerges as a result is an artifact, which is an outward manifestation or an incarnation of that inward art.
Yes.
And the reason that's important is because that doesn't mean that art is purely subjective, right? There's an ontological, objective reality to it. And that's one of the reasons why there is such a thing as, first of all, good and bad, but there's also such a thing as that's not art. In other words, if I decide, I say, I'm an artist, and therefore, and I'm going to go take feces and put it on a plate and stick it out in a gallery and say, and therefore that's art. That's not true.
It's
to not
be emergent out of the potential.
Yeah, that is not a manifestation of the artistry that is within me.
Right.
Right. Like the art, the skill set of drawing or painting, whatever the art may be, which obviously cooking is an art, music is an art, right? It's not a manifestation of that. And so to call it art is false. It's not true. And And I think that's the thing that's always been there in my framework about art. And that's one of the reasons why I had said, and I'm sure these are some of the conversations that you're thinking of, I would use as an example somebody like Picasso. I'd say this at art school and it would upset people because they'd be like, I think he's talking about me, but it would be like, I'd point out, if you look at Picasso's drawings when he's like 16, he's a Renaissance master. He has mastered the art of drawing in a classical sense. So he's cultivated that art. Now, that's what I meant back then when I was younger and I said the right to do it. If he wants to go ahead and start to draw distorted figures in some ways, well, that isn't a manifestation of his inadequacy. That's how he's choosing to utilize that skill set now.
Yes.
And so he's, as somebody who can draw a face in a realist sense, he can now choose to draw it in different ways. And that will actually be an expression of his artistic skills. And so the thing is with Picasso, whether you like his stuff or not, it's not the work of somebody who's just a hack who doesn't know how to draw or paint, right?
Right.
You can dislike it. You can think it's not as good as other stuff. You can think it's bad art, right? You can make all of those sorts of judgments about it. But to say that it is not the work of somebody who is an artist is not true. However, are there people who come along and they look at Picasso and they go, oh, that's art? I could do that. And the answer is they can't do that because what Picasso is doing is looking at something real. He knows how to manifest it in a real way, and then he's figuring out how to twist it, right? This person doesn't know how to do the first couple of steps, right? And so what they're doing is just bad drawing.
Yes.
Right. But the thing is, and this was, I think, something that I had said to you, I know that Kevin Van Hooser was really intrigued by the same, thing that I would say about art history, is that certain artistic movements like that, even though they were meant to be an exploration of a possible advancement, what they ended up doing is they ended up creating room for non-artists to come in and do non-art, but pass it off as art. Because the average person doesn't know the difference between what Picasso did and what the guy who just can't draw it did. And so, so I saw the deconstruction of art and postmodernity and things like that as a massive step backwards, and continued to toe the line in terms of saying, no, art isn't just an expression of emotion. Art isn't some amorphous cultural construct. Art isn't, and I always attacked those more deconstructionist or what you might call nominalist senses of art, where it's just whatever we make it into, right? Whatever we say it is. And there's no such thing as good and bad and all that. It was really, I always had and continue to maintain that very objectivist ontological sense of it.
It's a lot of different questions that are coming to my mind, and I'm going to get back to the story of your art journey proper. But do you see that analogy working out in people's spiritual lives as well? Do they need to walk? Do they need to do the basics well in order to, in a sense, blossom into the kinds of religious others that they should become?
Yeah, well, I mean, here I'll speak from my Eastern Orthodox perspective, and this is one of the many things that I think is true in Eastern Orthodoxy. I think one of the things that happens within the Latin West, and then as it grows up and becomes Protestantism, and then sort of becomes modern Protestantism or evangelicalism, as we know it today. First of all, there was a tendency to see Christianity as a largely judicial religion, right? And to talk about things like merits and demerits and prevenient grace and how it enables you to do things that are meritorious. And in many ways, if you were to frame the human condition and God and things like that, you would largely talk about the fact that God is a moral lawgiver. We are moral law breakers. We are a damned mass. We're going to face judgment, and we're in a judicial predicament as a result. So the gospel is that Jesus is here to remedy, and the church is here, if you're Roman Catholic, right, here to remedy, that judicial predicament and get us right with God in preparation for the future judgment. And obviously how that works out in Protestantism and Catholicism is different. But, that's sort of a certain way of framing it. And one of the things that I think has sometimes been, used as a way of framing East-West differences, which I think is fair, even if it's an oversimplification, is to say that in the West, the Western Christianity is largely judicial. In the East, Christianity is largely therapeutic. And by therapeutic, here the concept is more that the human condition and the gospel has more to do with ontology. And I think this is actually, just as an aside, it's a really interesting thing that East-West differences in the Roman Empire, the sorts of differences that I would talk about, apply not just in Christianity, East-West, Latin, Greek. It applies in Neoplatonism. It applies in Judaism. And so it's an interesting thing that the center of law
Yes.
in the Latin West, Rome, also becomes the center of this very judicial way of thinking about topics,
Yes.
right? A very legal way of thinking about topics. Whereas in the East, in the Greek world, the center of philosophy, everything's ontological, right? And it's an interesting dichotomy as an aside. But one of the things that I think comes out there is that when looking at the understanding of man and the gospel and things like that, a lot of what you find in the Eastern Church Fathers, that's early Eastern Christian writers, is that the human condition is largely seen as something that is part of a story about the making of man, that ontologically God creates man in a certain way with a certain intent, right? This is the image likeness distinction. We're made in the image of God, where we're rational and free.
I think I saw that podcast.
Yeah. But the likeness is what we're supposed to grow into through communion, imitation, participation in God. And that the fall has largely to do with a movement backwards, a regressive movement that distorts our nature and makes it difficult, if not impossible, on our own accord to remedy it, to excise the cancer that's in the system, so to speak.
Right.
And that what the incarnation in the gospel is about him who is incorruptible, and his life in himself enters the cancerous organ in order to drive out the corruption.
The great physician. That's right.
That's right. And so he heals it from the inside. And here, this is where actually everything about his life and his crucifixion and his descent into Hades and his resurrection has everything to do with completing the making of man and turning man into what he is supposed to be. And then Christianity has everything to do with the sacramental life, the life of repentance. All of this has to do with us entering into that, therapeutic participation in becoming fully human, which is what you see in him. And so that's a very long prelude to say that I think essential to how at least the Christian East has seen spirituality generally is exactly what you just said, that you as a human being bear the divine image, which carries with it innately the potential of what would be called deification, which is this participation, this resurrection, this glorification.
So that's truly good news. I mean, in this sort of analogy between art and spirituality.
That's right. And I would also say, this is also a big anthropological difference, right? And I won't get too far afield with this, but I'll just say, when you compare the anthropology, and this is largely because of the Pelagian dispute in the Latin West and the doctrine of original sin, there's a tendency to create what's called a nature-grace divide, where nature can't do anything pleasing to God of its own accord, not because of the fall, but just in itself. That's true of Adam and Eve too.
Right. And
so grace is this sort of supernatural invasion that allows it to sort of, now do things that are pleasing God. Whereas in the Christian East, that divide doesn't exist. There is a divide between nature and supernature, if you mean, creator and creature. There's a divide in that. But it's perfectly natural that you as an image bearer can commune with God and be deified. That's not an arbitrary magic trick, right?
Right.
And so when the Eastern Fathers look at the nature of man, they really do look at it as, well, the image of God is the very thing that makes it possible for you to be deified, to commune with God in those ways. What Christ is doing is just unearthing those. I think one of the best pictures of this is actually how Gregory of Nyssa reads the parable of the lost coin. And so, the parable where you have the woman who has the coin, she loses it in the house, she has to clean out the house, find the coin, throws a party, right? And how Gregory of Nyssa reads this is that the house is humanity. The coin is the image of God. The clutter are the passions that covered it up.
Interesting.
And the woman is Christ, who comes in and clears away the passions through the incarnation in order to find the coin and celebrate with the angels that it's been restored.
Interesting. So again, we're getting a little bit off, but it's so interesting. I want to ask more questions. One more question. How do, I guess I don't immediately see that the two paradigms are incompatible.
Mm-hmm.
But secondly, if you think of something like the Roman road, which is a common sort of Protestant evangelistic tool for all of sin and fall short of the glory of God, is that not an Eastern way of approaching the whole, evangelistic, endeavor?
Yeah. And I would say probably not. But the reason is, there are a couple of different reasons, and I don't want to get us too far afield with this. But I think the short answer is this: I'll use a doctrinal example that sort of highlights the divide. So within the Christian East, just like in Roman Catholicism, Mary is thought to be sinless. Now, the ramifications of that, what that means, all that sort of stuff, it's different in the East than in the Roman West, and different in ways that I've got a podcast on. But, it's different.
I got to see that one still, so keep going.
But here's one of the things that's critical. The evangelical mind, because of that sort of Roman road,
right,
that sees guilt before the future judge, sin as the primary problem. And by sin, they mean moral infraction.
Right.
The Eastern Fathers don't mean moral infraction by the word sin. But the evangelical response is, well, if Mary didn't sin, she doesn't need a savior, right? And the Eastern Fathers, by contrast, see the primary enemy of man, the condition that Christ comes to remedy, as death. And in the East, there is a feast day that commemorates the Dormition, or the death of Mary.
I see.
And so her not committing moral infractions doesn't remedy the human condition.
Yes.
She still needs the work of Christ in order to be saved from death, right? And so I think that right there captures the difference, that really with the Eastern Fathers, they're like, yeah, moral infractions are corruptions. They're not what's supposed to be, but there's a lot more about us that's not what's supposed to be. And the healing of the person is body, soul, the whole thing.
Yes.
And just not doing wrong things doesn't fix the problem. So and that's one of the reasons why, going back to your original question, I do think they look at the spiritual life as exactly that. It is the struggle and the work that ends up drawing into existence ontology, and this is part of, like, because of the Roman Catholic Protestant discussion, they're like, for merits, to earn God's favor through works. Like, the Eastern Fathers aren't even thinking about that. They're thinking, you're sick and dying. This is the road of getting healthy. Like, do you want to get better?
Yes.
This is just what you do to get better, right? You're not trying to earn anything. This is about ontology, right? And that's where, your question about whether the ontology of art that I described is an analog for that. Their answer would be absolutely, right? This is the spiritual potential that is within a person and the rigorous road that a person has to walk in order to cultivate that, of course, with the grace of God, through communion with Christ and the sacramental life and all that. So,
I see. That's fascinating. Yeah. So when Paul says things like, shall I go on sinning so that grace may abound? By no means. The Eastern way of saying that is you're not realizing you're truly human. Whereas the Western way is like saying, well, okay. Maybe I could be actually more into grace.
I think this is one of the things. Just as somebody who comes out of a Lutheran context because of my mom, right? That's her background. I do think there are a lot of, like, Lutherans, for example, who do struggle with that. They're like, I know we're not supposed to say yes. Right? I know we're supposed to say, no, you really shouldn't sin. But at the same time, there is a tension there that starts to emerge that says, if my deeds
save you from that,
if my deeds aren't relevant to salvation and things like that, why don't we go on sinning, right? Whereas the Eastern Fathers are looking at it saying, death and corruption. Maybe I should explain one of the things that I'd said earlier. I said moral infraction is not what the Eastern Fathers mean by sin,
right?
it includes that. I should say it includes that. But sin, as far as they're concerned, is just any corruption. So if I were born without a right hand, that would be sin, right? Not because I've done something morally wrong, but because it's a corruption. It's what's not supposed to be.
That's right.
And so, yes, you as a moral agent who are supposed to be virtuous, shouldn't do wicked things. That is sin, right?
Yeah.
But in many ways, that's seen as just the cancer at work.
Yeah.
And so this is all about, do you want to live and die with cancer, or would you like to become fully human and live, right?
Wow. Well, that's fascinating. Very interesting connection between the artistic and the spiritual.
Didn't see that coming, but
yeah. Well, if we backtrack again, we left Micah and the Maryland Institute of Art there, and we make it to Trinity, and you're doing art, and I'm aware of it because it's showing up in my office, and it's showing up whenever we take trips or we stop over somebody's house. There's Nathan, he's painting again. Where's he at? And so you're doing all of that stuff. And I think that the evangelical world at Trinity, at least the way it manifests itself at Trinity, respected that.
Yeah, they did.
And a lot of us professors celebrated that, said, man, we could use a little bit more of this around here. And so we encouraged you to keep going. And, there's an event that happened. We haven't talked about this in years. So I'm going to throw this one at you. But one of the things that was a cultural event at the time was the Passion of the Christ.
Oh, right.
Which had come out.
Yep.
And both of us, probably for slightly different reasons, were smitten with this movie and Mel Gibson and the whole the making of it and the artistic excellence of it and all of that. And we felt like we needed to do something significant.
Yeah.
So one of the things we tried to do was like, can we leverage Nathan Jacobs' passion for art and his ability to do fine art to meet Mel Gibson, but B, get you into seminary for a master's degree through this artistic moment that the entire culture was experiencing because of the Passion of the Christ. And just young people, when I deal with classes today, like I was just with prep year when about 34 students, and we talk about the Passion of Christ, and they find it hard to believe that I went to it 3 times with students. Oh. They find it hard to believe that the theater was packed every single time.
Every single time.
I mean, people crying outside the doorways of the theaters.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I want to just put that context to it. This isn't 2 crazy guys who were being caught up in the moment. We were like average, normal guys, and that's.
I mean, it's one of the highest grossing films of all time.
Yeah, and we felt like it awakens something in us between the academic world, the art world, the spiritual world, all combining there in that great sort of cultural moment. And you get set to work on tell me if I got the terminology right, a triptych.
Yeah, that's right. Plotted it.
And that is the 3
panels,
Christ and the 2, the thieves on the cross, and you started sketching, working this out as a triptych, and we thought, my goodness, wouldn't it be wonderful if you could do this and show it to Mel Gibson, but B, we could promise it to Trinity and maybe get you a scholarship of some kind.
Yeah, we were trying to pitch. I remember at this time, this was ironically before we were really doing anything serious with film, before I was doing anything serious with film. We were like, well, what if we document it? And then we came up with this concept for Finding Mel Gibson was the name of the documentary. And the whole thing was, let's document. And we were talking with a legit documentarian about doing it and all that. But the concept was, what if we document the conceptualization, the making, of this painting?
This is, I think, life size we were going for.
It was so what it was, because I started on the first panel. I still have it. And it's freaking great. But sorry, can I say that about my own stuff? No, it's really good. It's really good. You can actually, I don't know when this is going to drop relative to my new website, but if my new website is up, which will be, you could get to through the nathanjacobspodcast.com or nathanajacobs.com, or hypothetically the eastwestseries.com. Like any of those will take you to some facet of the website. And it has an art section. That's how you'll know you'll have the updated website.
Can we see
that panel?
piece?
That panel is there.
Oh,
now it's just the underdrawing, right? Like I never got to the painting phase of it.
right.
But yeah, it was so it was 3 4-foot by 4-foot panels. And so yeah, and I had mapped it out. It was very realist, very Renaissance, very chiaroscuro, if you know what that is. That's basically the very high contrast, like Rembrandt type style.
You know, you had this professor, i.e. me, who was promoting you and this opportunity, this film, this moment for evangelicals to say, you know what? We love art. We can do art. We can, you know, we can ride on the back of this for a while. And, put together this massive proposal. This is back in the world when it was hard to write proposals.
Yeah.
We wrote a 10-page single-spaced proposal with sketches and
I had already plotted.
The idea was that you were going to what were we looking for when was
well? So that's the interesting thing. I think this is I think this. Well, we were looking for funding, but I think it's important to contextualize like why would you do this, and this will come into play as we talk about more the sort of artistic side of things. But I just wanted to say thank you, to Mel Gibson.
Yeah,
and I can talk more about why that is. But the short answer to why that is was that I was like, finally, a contemporary, good piece of Christian art that I'm not embarrassed to say, I love this thing.
Right.
And I think it was recognizing me speaking from my perspective, just as an artist. It wasn't evangelism impact or, anything like that. It wasn't the box office. It wasn't, oh, good, we've got an opportunity for Christian filmmaker. There was nothing like that in me. I mean, I was still a wild-eyed heretical philosopher, but I was still an artist who is on a deeply religious journey.
Yes.
And to see, I mean, keep in mind, again, for people who don't remember this era, maybe they're younger, Mel Gibson was Hollywood. Like at this point, like you couldn't get bigger than Mel Gibson.
Yeah.
Right. In terms of, and so at the height of his career, he decides to do this gamble. He wants to do this film. All the studios want to screw it up. None of them are interested in doing it. He has to finance it. I think it's $20 or $25 million budget out of his own pocket because he believes in it and it needs to be done right. We know that he's Roman Catholic, and so this isn't just some guy doing a thing. He actually does like revere the source material and actually believe it.
Yes.
And it was one of those things where I was like, look, we don't get many cathedrals anymore, but like movies are sort of the closest thing to a modern cathedral in terms of all these different artists, musicians, cinematographers, costume designers, so on, coming together into one sort of orchestrated effort. And this guy, out of his own pocket, at the height of his career, despite the fact that Hollywood didn't approve, decided to do this project. And I was so floored by it.
Yes.
That I was like, this is art, right?
Yes.
And this is very good art from somebody who really believes this stuff. Now, I wasn't a Catholic, right? I didn't believe the things that Mel Gibson believed, but I didn't care.
Right.
Because I was like, what I see is the same thing I see when I see any other cathedral. Like when I went to the Strasbourg Cathedral and I was blown away and, razed to the ground by it. It's the same thing that I saw there.
Right.
And so I just wanted to say thank you as an artist who was on a spiritual journey. And so the artwork was really a vehicle to try to get to him just to say thank you.
Yeah, we used to talk about the artwork as a passport, as I recall.
Yeah.
It can take us places.
Yeah.
And if we do this right, we can get to Mel Gibson, which nobody else could. He had fallen off the grid at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, maybe we could move people to seeing the significance of art in the evangelical spaces, which tend to be pretty barren of art.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you were quickened in your journey, both academically, spiritually, and artistically, all at once in that moment. And so we put this 10 page single-space proposal together,
Mm-hmm.
not really knowing what we were after. I think we were after funding and the permission. Maybe I was after a sabbatical. I can't remember, to do it in order to actually go after Mel Gibson. And Jeanette,
No, I think I know what it was.
what was it? What was the end game on that?
Yeah, no, I now remember what it was. I was trying to remember what it was since too, but I remember because we had tried to do the fundraising for the documentary and we couldn't get there.
Yes.
Our backup plan, this was our plan B, was maybe given the price that it would, like essentially what a triptych like this would cost.
Yes.
If the university was willing to buy it, fund the creation of it,
Yeah.
and then they would keep it, obviously.
Yes.
That would buy my year.
Yes.
In order to go ahead and paint it and us to do the documentary. And then maybe we can go ahead and we can sort of shoestring the documentary. So it was all about trying to convince Trinity to purchase it because of this greater vision.
Yes. Yes. Okay. So Jeanette Shea, who was the dean at the college, she was awesome. Best dean we ever had, I think.
She was great.
She takes this 10-page proposal, goes to the board. And I remember walking out and meeting her sort of halfway on the lawn there at Trinity.
Mm-hmm.
And she's just shaking her head. I go, well, what happened? And she said, I don't believe what I'm about to tell you. I said, wow, did we get the money? No, you didn't get the money. But they decided they loved the proposal so much that they would like to give Nathan a free scholarship for his master's degree.
Yeah, it was such a bizarre counter proposal.
Yeah, we didn't see that coming.
Right.
Like, dang, the power of art.
Right. Oh, that's true. That's true.
And I don't think that has ever happened in their history, as far as I know.
Yeah. I mean, of all the things to win a full ride.
Yeah, the art came through, and yeah, I'm glad you did one panel. You went on to do the master's degree.
Yeah.
And we spun our wheels in terms of trying to see Mel Gibson. That was an early effort for us. We had not stepped into the art world. I mean, together on film or anything, or anything like that. But that was an initial sort of, I don't know what you'd call it, trigger that started saying, well, maybe we could do stuff in this realm.
Yeah. I'm sure we can talk more about that when we get to the film stuff.
Right.
But yeah.
Right.
Like it was, I think that was something that awakened us to this idea that you could do film. That we were talking to legitimate filmmakers about a project, and that always seemed like, at least I think a lot of people nowadays, because of both digital technology, because of tax incentives that have drawn filmmakers into different states, a lot of people are accustomed to like, yeah, I've got a cousin who works in film, or I know this guy I go to church with, he works in film, right? But in our back then, before the tax incentive push had drawn business out of Hollywood, and before, you had digital and you were actually shooting on film, right? And the cost of shooting had dropped. To meet a real filmmaker was an oddity, right? Like that's a rarity unless you live in LA or something. And so the very fact that we were seeing doors open, and this was actually right around the time that the tax incentives were starting to pull people into different states, if I'm remembering correctly the timeline. But I think that awakening that there were accessible filmmakers was a critical feature in what started my wheels turning, at least about the possibility of doing film.
So you're attending, I guess, Lutheran or Anglican churches at this point. Is that right?
No. I mean, that wouldn't have been until down the road.
Down the road a little bit. Okay.
Yeah.
But how does the art then, I mean, you go on for a PhD. Are you still doing art in the PhD world? Because that seemed like that's a big ask.
No, I wasn't. I mean, I was. I had like that panel actually in my dining room.
Right.
And I would just, whenever I got sort of
Right.
a moment, I'd grab graphite and I'd start like going at it. So I do that. I would draw during class,
Right.
and things like that. But I wasn't doing like commissions and the
So
sorts of things.
help me understand then the migration from, now you still do art. I see it everywhere here, by the way. It's all over the place. You still do this, but the film in the sort of cathedrals that those represented became more of your focus. How does that replace that or over time?
Yeah. Well, let me actually back up to something, drawing on Mel Gibson, and then I'll sort of work my way forward into that, because I think there's a critical feature that art plays in my story that I don't know if you and I have ever talked about. Now, I do talk about it in there's a volume that just came out from St. Vladimir's Press. Is it called Turning East? I think it's called Turning East 2. So in Turning East, if I'm remembering the name right, it's either Facing East or Turning East, but I think Facing East is the Frederica Matthews Green book. So Turning East is this book that was done by Rico Vitz, who's a philosopher in the Honors College at Azusa Pacific. He's Orthodox.
Yes.
And he had noticed that there were a bunch of philosophers, people like David Bradshaw or whoever, who had become Orthodox. And so he was curious about this, decided to do a volume where he got these philosophers to tell their story about how on earth does a philosopher become Orthodox.
Yes.
And I guess it was successful enough. They were like, do you want to do a second volume? So he did. And this time I got pulled into it. I think that one the first volume probably came out before I was even Orthodox, right?
Yes.
But I got pulled into it along with some other people. And in that essay where I talk about my journey to Orthodoxy, that's the one published place where, and you can hear it on my podcast. I think I did it on my Substack. I talk about it, but that was the one published article where I tell this whole journey. And I talk in there about the role of art in this. And again, I'm not sure if you're going to recognize this one, so it'll be interesting.
I'm intrigued.
So one of the things that happens here is that throughout, as I'm having these certain early religious awakenings, I was, zealously pursuing God. If you're there, talk to me.
Right.
Like, if you're there, make yourself known, right? Like, if I'm just talking to the air, fine. But if I'm not, like, do something. And I was really zealously begging and pleading with whatever's out there to talk to me, to meet me, to be present in this. And one of the things that always drew me in, where I was just like, I found it so alluring, was religious art. And I don't mean religious art like bookstore, sort of, decor that you might find in a house. I mean cathedrals, right? So when I looked at my favorite art, and this is probably no surprise to people who recognize that, what I just said earlier about art and the ontology of it, probably wouldn't be a surprise that I gravitated primarily toward high skill level art, which was very classical. And so a lot of my favorite artists, Michelangelo, Caravaggio, and then some contemporary people, more contemporary, like John Singer Sargent, but a lot of them were religious artists.
Right.
And the thing that I found so intriguing was that, or alluring, I should say, was that when I saw art like that, not just on its own, but in context, where it's part of a cathedral, or it's part of a temple, that I found seductive. Now, I didn't have a framework because I was an empiricist for most of my early philosophical journey. And so I didn't have a framework for talking about transcendent realities participating in images or symbols, right? Like I didn't have when you're an empiricist, right? That's just psychology, right? That's all it is, right? But there was this part of me that's like, I don't know, man. I get a vibe from religious spaces like temples and things like that, that seems like there's something there. Like these aren't, and it wasn't just Christian, right? Go into an Egyptian wing of a museum and you're like, I don't know if these statues are just statues, man. There's some like bad juju attached to some of these, right? And that was always an intuition that I had, but I didn't know how to process it because I was like, I don't have anything in my worldview to frame this.
Yes.
And yet there was always a part of me that had hoped that somehow maybe there was legitimacy to this.
Yes.
And so the reason I think that's important, and that ties in with the Mel Gibson stuff, was because it was another manifestation of religious art that felt in some ways sacred. Right.
Yes.
And so I bring that up as an important part of my journey, because part of the journey into Eastern Orthodoxy was that so many different things in my journey clicked. And that sense, that intuition that I talked about, that said, I think religious spaces and temples and artwork isn't just that, suddenly made sense in an Eastern Orthodox context. All of a sudden, this idea that this is an actual temple, that holiness is something that's ontological. It's not just that humans can participate in these holy realities, but artifacts can. There is such a thing as a sacred space, and not just sacred in a psychological or social sense, but a participatory sense. All of a sudden started to click and make sense. And it's funny because, of course, like Byzantine style of painting isn't my favorite style of painting, but it was still the vehicle for communion with the holy in my experience.
Yes.
And so anyway, all of that's to say is that I think that's a critical feature to recognize, that sitting in the background of my journey, my spiritual journey, was an intrigue with the religious space, religious artifacts, the idea that a certain space can be sacred. And that all went all the way back to Old Testament, right? It was something that I saw in the tabernacle. It was something that I saw with the Ark of the Covenant. It was something that I was like, the way the ancient people approached, worship, it wasn't just like there was something going on here, right? Like there is real danger. You're stepping into some sort of place that is the dwelling place of a deity. It's not just an ordinary space, right?
Yes.
And that was the thing that had always haunted me. And it was something that always haunted me precisely because so many of the artists that I loved and the things that I gravitated toward were in sacred spaces. And so that was always there, like, to quote The Matrix, like a splinter in my mind, where it was like, what do I do with this draw toward religious art that seems like something more than just the topic, right? It seems like it has a certain appropriate context that's participating in something transcendent. So anyway, that's one of those things that I wanted to go back to there. Now, in terms of moving forward, right, and this is where you're like, well, how do you make that transition? I mean, you were asking about, remind me of which transition you were asking about. Was it the transition from like art to film?
Here's what I have in my head here, because all that's fascinating. I think that's great context for you having to explain actually some of the things that happen, because there's a movement where film starts taking more of your time and energy. Something happened in the Academy in 2009 we've talked about before, where there was this downfall, and the Academy did not, we were all cognitively aware of the fact the Academy's not acting very well to this. They're not true to their principles, and people are not doing too well with it, and we were looking for a way to express ourselves in light of this. And this is where we said, hold on a second, why don't we make a film? Now we had explored this motif in a class earlier called Philosophy, Theology, and Film. Steve Pointer had graciously, when you were a professor at Trinity, allowed us to co-teach this class. And someday I'm going to publish that somehow, some way, maybe even on the Firestone files.
Oh my goodness!
Because it's an intriguing time in your life where you start to say, "Let me move out, not out, but let me move adjacent here into the film world and to do something with that.
Yeah.
And we did. We made a movie, a short film called Last Wish, in the making of Last Wish. And that quickened, I think, in you the idea that, man, I could be doing this a lot more than I currently am. And when we had this downfall of the academy, as it were, because of culture, because of the housing crisis or whatever, and we decided, let's go ahead and make a feature film, which apparently you can only do once. What's called that micro budget film. We got to,
since you'll burn every relationship you have.
Yeah, well, you had some friends that I didn't know, but you introduced me to them. The Engstroms.
Oh yeah,
and they were already in cinematography in the film world and using cameras, and so connecting all the dots, we started getting this idea, maybe we can do a feature film, and began writing. We were working with Edgar Allan Poe at the time, and very, I think, true to Poe type of script writing.
Right.
Somehow we started writing funny.
I remember.
Ended up writing Killing Poe, and you ended up directing that and getting A-list actors, and it was just an odyssey I didn't know that I really wanted to go on, but I was wanting to, A, be supportive of you, and B, wanting to make a statement to the Academy that we're done with you for a while.
Yeah.
We're going to go into the film world and do something there.
Yeah.
And ended up making Killing Poe out of that. It's basically about a 3-year odyssey to get that thing made.
Well, I'd say I see 3 different things at work here, right?
But yeah, how does that happen? Because that's not a religious film per se.
It's not. No, it's definitely not. I see 3 different things happening simultaneously in this, right? Like there's this one thing about struggling for an artistic voice, which I'll talk about that. Right. One thing. The other thing is just a general interest in film, which I'll talk about that. And then the third thing is what clicks when I get to Becoming Truly Human, which is the second film.
Right.
So I'll start with the one in terms of the artistic voice. I struggled, and even though I did all this art, I really struggled with, and I don't know if you recognize how much I struggled until very recently.
Right.
Very recently, like the last maybe 6 years, and the reason was, I mean, I think a lot of artists, well, I shouldn't say. I don't know how many artists. I'll just talk about me. I struggled with the fact that I admired certain artists, and I would always be torn by this whole like, oh, I really love that person's style. I'd love to do that, and I'm trying to imitate that. Or, oh, but this other style, I really love that, and I'm trying to imitate that. And it was this pull in all these different directions that I think really made me spin my wheels, and spin my wheels in a variety of ways, right? Spin my wheels in the sense of, I'm not being honest about what I really like topically. I'm not really exploring how I would do a thing or something like that. And let me make that a little more tangible. If I could go back and give advice to my 16-year-old self, right? Or in the same advice I'd give to any artist that's out there, young artist that's out there. What I would do is I'd grab my 16-year-old self and I'd go, all right, Nathan, let's have an honest talk here. Who's your favorite artist? No, don't tell me it's Michelangelo. Like, no. Who's really your favorite artist? Nobody's going to hear. I'm not going to make fun of you. Who is it, right? And it would be Frank Frazetta. And so anybody who knows who Frank Frazetta is, he does like barbarians fighting dragons and busty women and whatever else, right? Like it's pure fantasy illustration. He's incredible. He's the man. I loved Frank Frazetta, but you can't say that, because he's an illustrator,
right?
And and that's sort of like, that anyway. Whatever the hangups were socially, that if you want to be an elite artist or whatever, that's not what you do. And I think one of the things that happened is because there was a lot of inability to just be reconciled to like, what do you like? What do you want to do? Forget what's socially acceptable. Forget what the art world thinks you should do. Forget even what you think you should do as somebody who's trying to be an elite artist. What do you really like? Right. And why don't you lean into that and just embrace it?
Yeah.
And I think the thing is, I spent so much time in art school and afterwards working against the grain of my natural inclinations artistically that I think I slowed my growth considerably. And it was only very recently, like over the last 6 years, where I was like, how would I do it? And I started to find my own methods, mixed media methods, and I'm still discovering those. But I stopped asking, how would Bouguereau do it? How do you do this old technique? And I just started asking, how would I do it?
Yes.
And what do I want to do? And what do I like? And so anyway, once I started leaning into that, that became, fuel in the engine. But I think that's an important context because artistically, I'm struggling and I'm frustrated, right? I can't find my voice and I'm just sort of trying to imitate a bunch of stuff artistically that, it's not quite clicking, right? Or it's only clicking up to a point. And, then when I try to force it in a direction that's not really me, it breaks, right? Anyway, so that's important context. The second thing that's important context is just that I always loved film, right? When I was a little kid, I would do things like I'd set up G.I. Joe action figures in fight stances. Like this guy's flipping over that guy, this guy's kicking that guy, whatever. And then I'd take a Polaroid camera and I'd find cool angles to capture the moment. And so I didn't know what I was doing as a kid, but what I was doing was cinematography. Right. Like I was setting up these cool movie things. And then in art school, I actually did do film. I did now for me, it was a throwaway class. Like nobody does film for a living. That's nonsense. Right. But the professor was like, man, you really should consider going into film. I was like, what am I going to do? Move to LA and to work in the film world? That's nonsense. Right. And I didn't consider anything of it. But then I kept bumping into other filmmakers along the way. And this was because of the tax incentives drawing people. Like there were filmmakers in Michigan when I was in there, out there studying at Calvin. It was like, what? And they would look at what I did in the video game world. And we didn't mention that, but I did work. Part of how I paid my bills in the latter days of my master's degree was I took a job working for a video game company. And so I was doing storyboard, concept art, cutscenes, things like that.
Remember that now that you mention it?
Yep. And then when the filmmakers saw that, they were like, man, this is good stuff. Have you ever considered going into film? And so anyway, that just kept on coming up. Yeah. People saying, have you ever considered that? Maybe you should consider that. And that started to eat away at me a little bit. It was like this thing that eventually I had trouble ignoring.
Yes.
And so the philosophy, theology, and film class was an opportunity, an excuse really, to say, could we get the university, to give us the time and the opportunity to pull together a bunch of free labor, namely the students, to pay and bring in speakers,
yes.
To learn the craft of film. And then finally, to bring in the filmmakers to do a short with the students. And it would just be a way of breaking the seal, basically, in terms of an exercise in film. And so anyway, that's a much longer story, but that was sort of the breaking of the seal on that thing that had started to eat away at me.
Yes.
And once I had that, I had the bug. I was like, okay, let's go ahead and do an independent feature film. So on the one hand, that just is just a love of film. But this is where I say the second movie, Becoming Truly Human, the documentary I did on the religiously unaffiliated, was the one that was so critical in pulling so many things together.
Right.
On the one hand, Eastern Orthodoxy had pulled together certain parts of my spiritual experience. I mentioned the artistic side and the experience of the transcendent as, through this, the physical realities that art is part of. That was true. That was there. And so that had pulled together certain disparate parts of myself. But I was still deeply struggling with the question of how do I work as a good steward of academics, which was winning, right? Like that was the part of me that was winning out most of my time, while also stewarding art, which I'm really sort of frustrated with, and I'm not finding my voice, and I'm having trouble getting it where I want it to go while I'm doing this academic stuff. And I think what happened was after we finished Killing Poe, that was a deeply satisfying thing. But again, it was just like another facet of me that's all disconnected. Becoming Truly Human came to me. It was a project that came to me because we had just finished Killing Poe. I had just become Eastern Orthodox. And in the Antiochian Archdiocese of the Orthodox Church was sitting there saying, like, we want to do a project and engage, people who are religiously unaffiliated, people with no religion. And as this group of people were talking about how to do that, my name came up. They're like, there's this guy. He's a philosopher. He's a college professor. He's also an artist, and he like just finished a movie, and and I think he might know how to speak to this group or understand this group. And so I got pulled in, and I ended up pitching that whole film. And we could talk about that if you want. But the thing was, even though it wasn't it was a documentary, which I was not a documentarian. That's not what I was interested in. But I sort of approached it the way I would a movie, structurally.
Right.
I had done the pre-interviews. I knew what people were going to say. I was looking at it structurally. How would I assemble this? How would I approach this? And so it was kind of like, I remember the cinematographer being like, this isn't a documentary. This is an experimental, documentary featured narrative, whatever. I was like, yeah, I don't know, man. This way. But I think the thing was that film was deeply satisfying in a way that I had never been satisfied by a project, because it had the rigor and the labor of so much of the artistic journey or like academic journey we had gone on. It was a work of art, and it was a work of art that pulled together the artistic, aesthetic side of me with the intellectual, academic side of me, with the desire to connect with people and the teacher in me. And so all of these different parts of myself that felt so fractured and irreconcilable, the thing I'd been groping for so long of how do I bring these together, that project solidified those, where I was like, whoa, maybe this is how I do that.
I hadn't quite thought of it that way, but now that you put it there, I mean, you think of Last Wish and the making of Last Wish is learning to crawl, and Killing Poe is learning to walk. And I think you demonstrate for all of us who went into the Killing Poe project. Get Nathan into the film world was the whole theme. And let him. I mean, he's got the skills. Let him be the point of the spear here. Learn the craft completely, get his vision out, and get from beginning to end of the filmmaking process completed. Who gets to, in their life as a professor, to make a feature film? Well, nobody. Very, very few do. But this guy did. And this is part of that story. But there wasn't a strong religious theme in there. There was more of and like we were saying before, a demonstration of craft, skill, the ability to produce a film from beginning to end. That means from fundraising, concept, storyboarding, getting the cinematographer crew, micro budget, gifts in kind, deferred payments, all that went into that process that you learned on the fly and made happen. And we got to the end. And I think, you and I were celebrating because we knew we'd done something that very few people get to do in life. And I think a lot of the people we were with forgot that was the whole point. That we were immensely successful in that project because we achieved the main thing we wanted to achieve, and that was having Jacobs write and direct and produce a feature film, which he can now replicate. And the first thing you replicate, if I'm hearing you correctly, is this kind of watershed spiritual piece of becoming truly human.
That's right.
And that kind of now brings, that's the learning to run part of this, and where the tools become a spiritual reality in your ontological being, as it were.
No, I mean, I think that's really true. You and I did run into that I think, look, I mean, filmmaking is rigorous. It is a brutal, brutal process, especially narrative feature filmmaking. And so when you do that with insufficient pay, insufficient conditions, people get burnt out. They get, they can come away with a really negative taste in their mouth. And that's one of the reasons why, you only make that movie once, because once people have done that, they've given a full month to those sorts of conditions and that type of burnout, they're like, I'm never doing that again, right?
Yes.
But a lot of people do it in order to achieve a credit or whatever it might be. And obviously for you and I, that had to do with me putting my hand to the plow, so to speak.
Right.
But and what we tried to do is pull in people who were hungry in different ways.
He wanted a CV line. He wanted camaraderie and a vision realized.
You would never be asked to be, be a gaffer on a film with your experience, but you could be on this one, right? Whatever it is, right?
Yes.
And it really is extraordinary, what was achieved, because the fact of the matter is I'm sitting here in the film world now, and I know what we shot Killing Poe for. You couldn't get a script written for that. It wouldn't even meet WGA minimums. And
people who watch that film today still love it. I mean, they're surprised by how good it is for quote unquote a micro budget film.
Oh, micro budget. Yeah. And so it's crazy. I mean, it's crazy what we managed to pull off there. I mean, I remember Sean Devereaux, who, if you look up Sean, he's worked on 100 films, all of which you've heard of. And Sean is a big visual effects guy. He's a guy who's working as a producer on some of my current stuff. Sean's a good friend. And I remember Sean watching that, and he's like, okay, how in the bleep did you make this for that? But he's like, I don't even know how you could afford the music for it. For that, yet less film that. Are you out of your mind?
Every gift in kind and every deferred line that we could get on a CV.
Yeah. So, I mean, it was a Herculean task that was a massive success. And I don't say a massive success because I think it's a fantastic piece of cinema. I think it's a good movie. I think it's funny. I see all the flaws through and through. I see all the ways in which the limited budget, manifests in the final product. I have a dream of one day having enough disposable income and favors in film to go ahead and redo the whole of post and turn it into what I originally envisioned it as. But which actually wouldn't cost that much, but that tells you a lot about how little money we were working with. But anyway, I mean, but the point is looking at it for what it was, which was demonstrating we can get from start to finish on this and learn all these lessons the hard way. It accomplished that. And you're right that Becoming Truly Human, ironically, had the same budget. Again, I'm not going to say what the budget was, but it did. And the difference is, with the skill sets we had done and all that, I was able to plan. I still had to call in a lot of favors. But that was a 5-day shoot. Shot that entire documentary in 5 days just because of rigorous planning and all that. Killing Poe was what, a 21-day shoot, I think it was.
Yeah.
And so
it was a whole month.
It was a 21-day shoot with SAG actors, with, a full crew, with multiple locations, full moves, all this sort of stuff.
Outdoor, indoor shooting, everything. I mean,
So, Becoming Truly Human is still, that's still a crazy budget, to get that documentary made. But in comparison with Killing Poe is sheer madness. It's ridiculous. And so anyway, but you're right that basically then that was what opened the door to make possible Becoming Truly Human. And Becoming Truly Human was the thing that catalytically sort of solidified, it gelled a lot of things for me.
Right.
And thankfully I also had a nudge that came with that. So I'd mentioned that was made, that was at the behest of the Antiochian Archdiocese. They wanted me to do something. They didn't actually pitch a documentary. I pitched the documentary, and they took a gamble, and there was a guy who decided to back it, Charles Agelot, who decided to get behind it and make it happen.
Yes.
And so, there were a lot of people behind the scenes making it happen. But that's where we went and did that. And then I had the nerve-wracking experience. Keep in mind, I'm newly Orthodox at this point. I hadn't had experience with seeing bishops or whatever. So I'm going to the Metropolitan at the Archdiocese. The Metropolitan is the bishop of an entire, of the U.S., right? Like,
Yes.
and so I'm at the Archdiocese. I'm sitting with a metropolitan, and it's like, okay, I'm going to play the movie for you, Your Eminence. Hope you like, hope you like it. Just me and him. And anyway, he got to the end. He's like, I'm obsessed with what you did here. He was an Arab guy, and he's like, I'm obsessed with what you did here. He's like, I want you to leave teaching, and I want you to make movies for the Orthodox Church. It's like, okay. You
I
gonna
remember you coming back and telling me about that. Wow.
I was like, you gonna pay me to do that? No, but we will pray for you. And I was like, okay, well, but the thing is, like, I still took that seriously, that ask. And then at a showing where, you know, at an event, again, this was actually Charles's doing, which I'm deeply grateful for Charles's support and all that. But at an event where there were a bunch of different potential donors and people like that, that did a screening of Becoming Truly Human, did a Q&A, talked about the things that I'm doing. And that's where I met who became my future business partner, Charles Lalonde, Chuck Lalonde of Camelon Holdings, a venture capital firm. And so that's where he had caught wind of what I was looking to do. And what I was looking to do, he thought was really intriguing. It related to a lot of the things that he was interested in. But I was moving from these lessons of like, I'm not a documentarian, but I like engaging ideas. How do I do this? And actually where I went after that was to horror.
Yes.
And I know that's probably for a lot of people like, what? But it was because I realized that film is resistant to the didactic, right? You know, show, don't tell, all that sort of stuff. But inevitably, depending on genre, you have to get into the rules of the universe. So if you're doing a time travel movie, inevitably there's going to be somebody who says, time travel? How is that possible? And some guy's going to grab a piece of paper and be like, well, you see wormholes and, you know, puncture the paper or whatever. You're going to get you, or if it's, and the thing that I realized was that with regard to horror, you have to talk about the rules of the universe. Who's the monster? Where does it come from? What is it averse to? How do we defeat it? All that sort of stuff. And so if you're going to world build in a horror context, you have to do that. And I thought, you know, it's really interesting that a lot of the most successful horror films have like Roman Catholic priests in them. And so the worldview is Roman Catholic. And I was like, what would it be like if you did a horror movie from an Eastern Orthodox perspective? And so that was sort of the seedling concept that started growing up. And I was already having conversations with like Lionsgate about this sort of stuff. And so somebody like Chuck was like, hey, I'm going to get behind this. And some other investors were like, we're going to get behind this. And we're going to fund this insane endeavor that you have of leaving the academy
and
a stable paycheck for some speculative, you're going to become a Hollywood writer director. But it did blossom into ultimately, it caught the attention of Sean, right? So ironically, I mentioned Sean. The first time he like got on board as in a producing role was because of this horror film. He came out to have breakfast with me I was working with Mike Flaherty, and Mike Flaherty is one of the founders of Walden Media. And so Mike was gaga for the project. And he's like, I know this guy, Sean, visual effects guy. I'd love to get his assessment of the visual effects budget on this. And so we had breakfast, and I showed Sean these animatics that I had done where you basically take storyboards and you actually like make them move, and you had sound design. And so you can basically see the scene in advance. I showed him some of the animatics, my concept art, all this stuff. And Sean was blown away, which is saying something because Sean works in Hollywood, right? Worked with every major director, every major studio, all that sort of stuff. And so he was sitting there going, who's this guy, right? And the thing was, he actually called me up super enthusiastic because he's like, look, I never read a script. People send me scripts all the time. Mike sent me the script. I wasn't going to read this. He's like, after I met with you and I saw what you're doing, I read the script. And he's like, he's like, look, I've heard people talk about wanting to bring together theology and film and do something that impacts culture and engages in a broader conversation. He's like, I've heard people say that all the time. I've never seen a single script that does it.
Yes.
It's like, your script did it. It's like, this is what I got into this industry to do. And he's like, so I am willing to work for free on this thing. And I was like, what? So anyway, that was how Sean got pulled in. And, as we moved on, he wasn't going to work for free. But, that's how Sean got pulled in. And then he introduced me to John Irwin, who, of Kingdom Story Company at the time. And John is the big evangelical director, who did, I guess he's doing Young Washington right now, but he's, I can only imagine, was the big thing that got him as a big Lionsgate deal. And so we went out to Nashville. I wasn't in Nashville. I was still at University of Kentucky at this point. And we sat down with him, and because he had talked with Sean. And he's like, hey, what you up to these days, Sean? And he tells him about the project. And John's like, they're at a birthday party. And John's like, keeps on going, tell me more about this project. Tell me more about the story. And then he's like, can I see the script? And Sean sends it to him, and John reads it. And he's like, texting him. He's like, does it stay this good throughout? Finally, he gets to the end. He's like, can Nathan be here for lunch with me tomorrow? And so Sean calls me up. He's like, you want to meet with John Irwin? I was like, sure. And so I drive 3.5 hours from Kentucky to Nashville in order to meet with John. Chuck, my business partner, hops on a flight and flies out. And next thing you know, we're sitting in Lionsgate Studios pitching this thing, talking about how to get this thing off the ground. And then COVID happened and everything got disrupted. But that conversation was what planted the seeds where John was convinced of my talent as a writer, as a director, and led ultimately to a first look deal with this new subsidiary that Lionsgate wanted to launch, right? And so it was Lionsgate Stars Kingdom Story, which eventually became the Wonder Project. But when it was first launched, it was sort of on the heels of Top Gun 2, and we want to do more mainstream America movies like this and that sort of thing. And so John was tasked with finding the Avengers, right, to, get first look deals and start to do content. And I was one of those people brought in. And so that's what eventually then pulled me into the show House of David.
Yes.
And that's its own long saga and so on.
Well, I was going to ask you about that because, that brings us kind of to the contemporary period here.
Oh, yeah.
And I think of two projects. One, I just saw you working on one.
Oh, yeah.
Can we talk about that one?
Yeah, go ahead.
Bent. And then the House of David. And when I think of the House of David, I remember you coming to my house in Deerfield when I lived there.
Oh, yeah.
And had this big, thick script that you'd written. And
more than a script, I had a bound copy.
Of
season 1 before Amazon had bought it.
I think I see it sitting over.
It's over on the shelf over there. Yeah.
But you remember we stayed up.
It was like
it
was like a 900-page.
And but I guess maybe you can speak to this question. The House of David requires you to work with secular folks, evangelicals, Orthodox. The whole gamut of people.
Right.
When I think of the Bent thing, I think of more of the Orthodox.
The Belt, or is that what you
Belt? Yeah, sorry.
Uh-huh.
The Belt movie. You just started writing it here before my very eyes.
Uh-huh.
How do you? Your story of going through Last Wish, going through Killing Poe, going through the Becoming Truly Human, now is arriving in major studios, as you just described, major deals, people who are actually making these films for a living regularly, and House of David's going to require you working with a lot of people who you wouldn't have known how to even work with. You're fully in the industry at that point. How do you square that with your spiritual journey and also with the Belt movie?
Right. Yeah, it is an interesting saga because part of the thing that was going on there is obviously John Irwin, as I'd mentioned, is an evangelical. I'm not an evangelical. Right. And so the early conversations with John when he was going to pull me in, and when he was first pulling me in, I don't think he was even intending to pull me in as a scriptwriter. I was working on a bunch of the way a first look deal works, just so people are aware. And it's basically you're getting paid a salary. And the salary is there so that you can develop and write and create possible projects. And the first look means the studio gets to look at all of those and decide, do they want them or do they want to pass?
Oh, right. Okay.
And so that's the first look part. And then, if they want them, then they have to, strike a deal and purchase them and things like that. And, I'm sure every first look deal is different, but in my case, right, you do work and you sort of keep track of the work and you rack up fees. And if your fees exceed what they're paying you, then you're owed a balance. But, if not, you're just being paid, right, to sort of pitch and develop. And so John knew we've got this historical theologian guy here, and we're about to do a show, like the flagship show for this right out the gate. He was like, we're going to do this show on David. We should pull him in like as a consultant. And I was like, okay, yeah, I'd be happy to be pulled in. But the first conversation I remember sitting there in the editing suites with him at Kingdom Story Company. And he's pitching this to me. And I was like, well, John, what's your red lines? Well, like, where are you willing to go with this? I was like, you said Game of Thrones, because that's how it was originally pitched to me. It became something that's not Game of Thrones, but, it was sort of like pitched to me as Game of Thrones, Life of King David. They wanted something more family friendly eventually, but like what was pitched to me was that. And so I was like, John, you said Game of Thrones, like how Game of Thrones can I go? And I started bringing up things like the Nephilim, right? Like the giants. I was like, do you mind if we go the route of like that they're demonic human hybrids, that they're demigods, right? And so he's like, oh, yeah, totally. And I'm bringing up the Witch of Endor and I'm talking about ancient Near Eastern magic. I'm like, how far can I push this? Right.
Right.
And so, John knew that, my red line is very different than his. Yeah. And I knew that too. Right. Like that. But he was like, push it as far as you want. Right. And he'll dial it back was the sort of intent. And then what happened for that reason, and this goes to your sort of integration of all these different perspectives. I put together a research team on it. And as part of that research team, I pulled in a secular scholar who I'm not convinced believes the Bible is true. I don't know. Right.
Right.
I pulled in an Orthodox priest, Father DeYoung, who is sort of, well known in terms of a lot of the ancient Near Eastern stuff. And then I did some additional consultation as well as my own historical research. And basically what I do is as we were working on the concept, sitting there in the writer's room and whatever else, I would just start to create all the different questions people had, all the different points of contact that raised scholarly questions. And I would disseminate that, first for myself, for DeYoung, for this other guy, for this other person. And then I'd get back the scholarly research and I would start to synthesize and consolidate it into a research document, a massive research document that started to create options for ways you could go or how you could interpret things or what's plausible, what's not. And so like that was the original role that I was being pulled into play. And so it's intriguing because I was trying to press for, when people do this, look at the show, I was trying to press in the direction of take seriously the scholarship. You don't have to agree with the secular guy who doesn't, believe the Bible, but you should be aware. And we should be looking for ways of, plausible deniability, hypothetically, right? Like, you can always make choices that you're just going to give a big middle finger to academia. That's fine. I've given my own middle finger to academia plenty of times, right? But like, let's try to take seriously whatever the scholarship is saying about these different topics. And so that in itself was a navigation of a whole host of different things that academia had served me very well.
Yes.
Now, the interesting thing was within day 2 of the writer's room, John was, clearly pulling me in, like, you should write for this. And I was getting into it, right? I was like, yeah, I'm into it, right? Like, that's cool. And so, but that became another interesting thing because another guy who had written on the show, Nate Wilson, N.D. Wilson, if people know him in a literary context, Nate became a very good friend. I didn't know Nate before that, but Nate is, if people know who Nate Wilson is, they know he's Reformed. right? So he's a very conservative, reformed thinker. And so theologically, he and I disagree. And it's kind of funny. I remember when he was introducing me to another film connection of his, and this guy happened to be, this producer happened to be, I think he was charismatic or something like that.
Huh.
And like, he was kind of navigating, trying to figure out how to gently navigate that Nate and Nate disagree. And we were just like, oh no, like no. I was like, no, I'm Orthodox. I think Nate's a heretic. And Nate's like, yeah, I think he's an idolater. And I was like, yeah, and we both think you're worse because you're, and like, and so he was kind of shocked, but it's because Nate has become actually a good friend through that working process, where we were able to acknowledge where we're different and have honest conversations about that. And yet there was something beautiful about the fact that this was Old Testament, because a lot of the more sort of like fiery topics that you might run into in terms of theological conflict, I don't want to say they're more New Testament, because obviously if you believe there's a cohesive theology here, they're old and new.
Right.
But Nate and I, how we saw the Old Testament and how we saw storytelling and how we saw how you would tell the story was in such great harmony that it was very easy for us to navigate those things together.
Right.
And so that became a beautiful sort of creative relationship. That's again part of this. How do you navigate these personalities? And then of course, when I get into the Hollywood context, right? On the one hand, I can talk about the Hollywood stuff, right? I can talk about the writing and directing, but then I would oftentimes, on House of David in particular, be pulled in as the producer who's like the scholar guy. And so all of a sudden I'm there with being asked in a whole like group of extras to talk about ancient Near Eastern customs and like how they would conduct themselves in this context, or like meeting with the props department and other places to consult about cultic worship in the ancient world. And so it became a very bizarre, eclectic mix. I mean, things like all of a sudden we have a need for a rewrite, and now we need a spellcraft thing, and I'm doing research on ancient Near Eastern spellcraft, but doing it in a cinematic context where I know the story and I know what it needs to do in the story. And so like, okay, I'm trying to fill a hole here, and they're sending me over to say, we need pages on this, and you're the only guy who can write that, right? And like, and so, or write it in a way that would be historically viable, right? And so anyway, I mean, that's some of the dynamics about, how those things started to play out in that context. Now, the belt is a totally different beast, if you want me to talk about that.
Well, I in the context of your spiritual journey, it's what's interesting to me is that you're finding your niche again in a more complex, more high stakes environment as you continue to migrate in your journey.
Yeah.
And so you could conceivably, using the same paradigm, look at the House of David as being the prolegomena, the working out of the skill set that you are now hoping to apply in a more spiritually significant film, The Belt.
Yeah.
And I mean, I guess that's the way I'm processing. I'm seeing this ebb and flow in your career, where you build the skill sets, you get the chops, as it were, and then you go out and do what is spiritually animating your soul.
Yeah, no, and I would say I saw two critical things happen during my time on Killing Poe that set the stage for things after that. One of them is when you talk about skill sets, that's true. And it was because when I got pulled into the writing process there, I was pulled in a way where I had to iterate. So, the show originally started as 7 episodes, and they want to expand it to 10 episodes, and they want to change it, right? And I kept on, because I kept showing up and performing, right? Like a lot of scripts rewrites would get handed to me, or I'd get pulled into different stuff. And so there was something over those 2 years before Amazon got involved in the show, that, I mean, the number of pages I had to crank out was a critical lesson, right? Like, I think early screenwriters, one of the things they suffer from is just lack of experience, right? They have one idea, they work on that idea, they refine that idea forever, and that's their only idea. And so they have no concept what it is to like build and tear down and throw in the trash and rewrite and, reconstruct. But nothing was precious throughout that process.
Right.
And so that's where that was really refining, because it didn't matter what I got attached to. We all go, we're tearing it down. We're doing a new structure now, right? Like whatever it might be. And so that was refining on the writing side. That was a really important part. And obviously seeing the whole process was valuable.
Well, so, I mean, just as an aside there, I mean, the echoes of your early artistic endeavors. I mean, one of the things that always shocked those of us who knew you is you'd have these fabulous pieces, and the next thing you know, you're whiting out the whole thing and redoing. And but I think you learned in that whole process, and then you began to manifest it, as I'm hearing from you here now in the script writing process. That nothing is sacred until it's done.
I mean, distasteful as it may be, right? Like a lot of babies need to die. Like that's the way they talk about it. Like you're going to have to kill your babies, and that's because like in writing, right? Like until you learn that process, you write a scene and you're like, oh, but this is my baby, right?
Well, we learned that years ago in the academic world. You want a good 15 pages, you got to write about 50.
Right. So that was one thing that was critical to the whole process. But I think a second thing that I learned firsthand was I got to see the way in which, from the inside, the studio system works. And unless you're the person who has the money and you're at the top of the food chain, you can't control what comes out at the other end. Doesn't matter how intimately you were involved in the writing or whatever. Like once the studio owns a script, the studio owns a script, And so I started to see firsthand that if you're really going to throw yourself into this and you have a very particular vision and a very particular skill set, a very particular reason, you're not just in this to get film credits and to say, I work in Hollywood. There's something you want to accomplish. There's something you want to say. There's stories you want to tell in a specific way. I came to realize you actually have to be the person who holds the purse strings, right? And so that does tie in with the belt, because the story of the belt is it's a weird story, how it happened. But I just get an email one day from Vadopeli Monastery on Mount Athos, which for people who don't know, like that's those are some of the oldest monasteries in the world. Vadopeli was originally built, or at least the churches around there go back to Constantine, right? These monasteries on Mount Athos. And so it's so many saints have come out of Mount Athos. It's a spirit. I mean, there's a joke, like if you tell an Orthodox person like, I'm going to the Holy Land, they're like, oh, you mean Mount Athos? Right? Like, it's this revered place. And I'm like, I'm getting an email from Vadopeli Monastery in Mount Athos. Why is this? And I realized that it's one of the monks who was talking to another monk there, and they have a vision for a movie, and they came across a script, and I realized, like way back when, because Mount Athos featured into the played a part in the story of that horror project I was working on. We were hoping maybe there's some world where we could go to Mount Athos, film there. If we can't film there, maybe we can scan environments and build 3D models or whatever, right? And so we had sort of wanted to get the script into their hands. And there was Father Adrianos was a monk there who we got it into his hands, and he read it, and he loved it, loved the concept, thinks this is great, but apparently that script had been sitting there on his desk all this time. And another monk who was like wanting, part of this whole rigmarole that they had been working on for years of like wanting to do this film related to the belt, which I'll explain what that is in a minute, goes into his office and sees the script, and he starts to page through it. He's reading it, and he's looking at the pitch deck, and he's like, "Do you know this guy?" And Father Adrian knows, "Oh yeah, Dr. Jacobs, I know him." Right. And he's like, "Can we contact him?" And so he reaches out to me. And so this is how this whole thing starts, and it's him and this other producer, Norris Chumley, and so they come to me, and they're like, "We want to do a film about the Agia Zoni, the holy belt of the Virgin Mother." Now, this is something that most people don't know about, right? But in terms of relics, right, from the life of the Virgin Mary, there's only two historically: a veil that she wore and a belt that she wove when she was pregnant with Christ, wore throughout her life, and trusted to St. Thomas. at her death. Those are the only relics. The veil's been lost, and the belt has, been broken into different pieces, but most of those pieces are at Vadopeli. And they're like, we want to do a movie about the Aghiazoni, about the belt. It's like, you mean like a documentary? No. Like a big Hollywood movie for like the world to know.
It does seem like this is a watershed opportunity for you.
Well, I was sitting here going, I'm not sure I understand what I'm being asked to do here, right? Like, Belt, Virgin Mary, miracles, big Hollywood movie. I understand all of those words individually, but strung together, I'm not sure they make any sense. But I was like, but it's Athos, fine, I'll talk with them. And so they had pitched different concepts related to the miracles of the belt. And so I'd looked at that and I was like, guys, I don't think this concept works. I'll do the best version of this. I'll like hammer out for you what I think the best version of this is, but let me tell you also why I don't think that even that version works. So I did that and we went through that process. And then I was like, just for my own education, send me whatever you have on this, right? Like historical documents, whatever. And they send it over. So I start reading these and I stumble upon this completely crazy story in letters and, historical documents that they've shared, that basically the belt ends up sparking the 1821 revolution, Greek Revolution, and the overthrow of the Ottoman Empire. And I was like, what? And it is a crazy story, and I'll give you a glimpse of it. But basically, to finish out this story, I went back to them. I'm like, guys, are you aware of the story? Because you're telling me you want a big movie for the world. You want a movie like what I'm reading in these letters. That's a movie, man. And it took a little bit of arm twisting. They were hesitant. I'm like, come on, where's your faith? Right. I actually did say that in one of the letters to one of the monks there, Father Procopius. Have some faith, Father. But anyway, they eventually were persuaded, and then that started to turn into this massive historical dive and multiple iterations and things like that. And so I've been working with them now for a couple of years, truthfully. I've gone to Mount Athos several times, but I went originally to see the Aghiazoni myself, to be blessed by the elder there, to sign the paperwork. I went and journeyed on a pilgrimage with the Aghiazoni through Cyprus. And saw the ways in which the people just flooded the streets there in order to see this and to venerate it. And then I did a separate trip where I went with the monks to Crete, and most of the events take place on Crete, for the film. And so we went to the original places. We went and met with historians. We went and talked with the mayor and all this sort of stuff. And then, throughout this, I've been doing, been in meetings with the historical guys and them sending over materials and all this. And anyway, it's been a long process of iterating, mainly because to bring together all of these elements in a way that on the one hand honors the history, on the one hand on the other hand accomplishes what they want to accomplish with regard to the belt, and to tell a story in a way that's really story driven and isn't just either a piecemeal historical documentary or isn't some sort of, preachy propaganda piece where you have a concept and you're building a story to facilitate that, but you're really telling a story that makes sense organically as a story that captures all this stuff. It's a tall order. And I could go into more details of why it's a tall order, but it became an epic wrestling match to find the angle that would satisfy all the dimensions of what's being demanded. Broad, secular, historical epic in the action genre that's grounded in true historical events and honors that history, while also highlighting the very real sort of miraculous features of it and the belief of the people in those miraculous features that factors heavily into the story. Like, it is not an easy project. But thankfully, right now, as we're finishing, you were here when I finished up the first.
Well, despite my inability to remember the name from last night, I did. I was amazed that you were jumping into such an action-packed story.
Yeah.
And I mean, in the hero's journey, this is the climactic moment for you because there's a lot going on there.
Yeah.
And, but it does seem like it not only has these Eastern component to it, but the Mary, component to it, all the various elements that are required to carry a story of this magnitude, from beginning to end, is really a chance for you to, I think to pull all of your immense experience together, to put this together. They got the right guy. Will they see the light? At the end of the day, in terms of funding and kind of getting it to the finish line. How's that part of this process?
Well, let me actually pick up first with what you said about the hero's journey, because I think that's actually not only is the film structured as a hero's journey, but I think you're right in the sense of, we can talk about, and we have talked about, all the different ways in which the different steps along the way planted the seeds and the work that was done and the cultivation of that potential actual, if we're going to harken back to the art, ontology that I talked about. Moving toward, a major project. And I think while there was a whole host of massive growth points that were all essential to getting to where I'm at right now, there were still significant blind spots that I had at work, in terms of, story and moving toward like the type of screenplay that is, the type that everybody dreams of writing, right? And I think the thing that's really interesting is that you can see this happen time and again in Hollywood. There's any number of times where somebody has a breakout hit, a director, M. Night Shyamalan, right?
Right.
And then all of a sudden they struggle to have another hit. And it's like, man, there was so much hope, right? And the thing is, like, I can, I can tell you why his films don't land anymore, right? But I'm not convinced that he knows why, right? And this is actually part of the perils of success, is because if you get to the point that the studio is going to greenlight your project, why do you need to listen to anybody, right? Why do you need to listen to a studio exec? And so there's something actually really useful about having to deal with execs, having to pass certain bars and things like that. That's not to suggest the studio execs know what they're talking about all the time. That's not to say that. But that tension between the artist and the surrounding support structure is really valuable. And I think something that oftentimes happens with directors is that once they hit that point of success where they get to call the shots, their art gets worse because they need that friction in order to make good art. Wes Anderson is another good example. Like with Wes Anderson, his early stuff is some of his best stuff. At some point, he almost becomes a caricature of himself because he doesn't have those sorts of constraints that were on there.
That's fascinating.
And so the reason I bring that up is I actually think had I succeeded, COVID doesn't strike, my horror film does end up landing its deal with Lionsgate, which looked viable, and I'm off directing it. I think it would have succeeded. I think it would have been dynamite. But I also know at that point, I've just written myself a ticket. And I haven't yet learned very important lessons that I need to learn in order to become the filmmaker and the writer and the director that I want to be. And I don't know if I ever do learn those lessons, because now I don't. Who's going to tell me what to do, man? I made that blockbuster film over there.
You go from the A to the master of the B film.
That's right. And so anyway, I say that because the last couple of years of working on the belt have been, it's been a lot of that friction. It's been a lot of that wrestling with the material and how do you make it work and so on. And at some point in there, I actually convinced the folks behind this, the monks and the producer, to go ahead and finance a writer's room for the second draft. So I'd done a first draft. They were pretty happy with it. They had notes, but I wanted a second draft. And I was like, no offense, guys, but like, you're monks. You're not going to give me notes that are much use. I would like to finance like a room of real writers. And thankfully we were able to get this guy, Bart Gavigan, who is, top rate script doctor, and a guy who he deeply trusts, as amongst the best of the best that you could also ask for, which is Chris Stout. But like Bart is a guy who hopefully he doesn't mind this being public information, but he was offered $7 million a year to be Spielberg's script doctor.
Yeah.
Right.
Wow.
And he turned it down because that's not what he wanted to do. Right. He's in the later part of his life, and he's like, I don't want to use the last of my years to make Spielberg's movies go from good to great. I'd rather mentor people who I think should be making, the big movies.
Yeah.
And thankfully, I qualified, right?
Wow.
And so
that's awesome.
So we financed this room, and that writer's room was itself a learning experience all its own. And it really refined, it felt like it dialed in the last of the things that I needed, the last of the tools, so that it's like, okay, yeah, you have the tools to go ahead and write. Nothing's precious. You have the ability to gauge in the room. But it was almost like that, working with Bart and talking through story and learning from him. It was like finally you see the code of the Matrix, where you're like, oh, I now see what's wrong with my script. I also see what's wrong with that movie and that movie and that movie and that movie.
That's
right.
Fascinating.
And so that was critical. So, I mean, this was highly influential on my thinking and on my script writing. I mean, if I could, if I were to tell you, for example, what I think of the movie Heretic, right? I think it's a great movie, but I think it's only like 90%. It could have been 100%. I could tell you why, but these would be a lot of lessons learned from that experience.
Yes.
So I say all of that because I think in terms of the hero's journey type thing, I think it was important that I learned all the lessons that I learned along the way. I think it was also important that I realized and could tell the monastery, look, you guys are going to have to finance this yourself. We get a studio to do it. It's not going to be the movie you want, right? And to see that from the inside and know the truth of that was really important. But it was also getting that last set of tools in terms of storytelling to be able to say, okay, I do think I'm now ready to be able to do the sorts of projects that I want to do. We'll see how the story plays out. Supposedly Vadopedi is going to be able to raise the money for this project, which is a lot of millions. And so we'll see. But, so we'll see how the hero journey plays out.
Experience with people of means goes way back. I mean, trying to convince people to get on board a vision, to actually follow through with their initial inclinations, you've done that before, and now we get to this much bigger project. Yeah. And I think you're ready for it. And what a the excellence, the willingness to set a bar and go for it and just keep plowing in that direction until you get there, and nothing's sacred until you do, as it were. And the integrative component of being a whole person in terms of your art talent, the spiritual journey that you're on, in the academics, and just being a good friend all these years. And,
thanks, man.
One thing I love about calling you is I'm going to get the truth.
That's true.
You're going to tell me what you really think about it. And, my inability to contextualize is the only limitations on that kind of feedback I'm getting.
Yeah.
And so I really have appreciated that, and hearing about these things in more detail. And there's so much more, and can't wait to dig into that.
Yeah.
Some other time. Stuff. But can I get a promise out of you that when the belt is in process or gets made, I'm going to get another interview with you about how you turn that corner.
Yeah, maybe you can come out to Crete, where we shoot on location.
As you've gotten to do some incredible things. That's one of them. It's going out on there and doing some due diligence in terms of checking out the place and the people there. And I'd love to do that. And if I can be of any support, you know what? Give me a place to stay.
Can I pass you off as a Cretan? I don't know.
I can definitely wear a toga or whatever. Anyway, so thanks so much for your time here and for this
My pleasure,
illuminating and inspiring discussion.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
That's it for the Firestone Files, and I guess
And for the Nathan Jacobs podcast.
And until next time, we'll see you guys later.
The Christian East and the Christian West share the same creed, the same scriptures, and yet they are worlds apart. The differences run deeper than Mary or icons or liturgy, going to the very nature of God, the hope of salvation, and even what it means to be human. They use the same words, but their meanings could not be more different. As these two worlds collide in our contemporary culture, what's needed is a translator. I spent nearly 2 decades studying these two traditions, devoting myself to figures like Augustine, Aquinas, and the Reformers in the West, but finding myself crossing the threshold of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And now, I'm producing a 25-part lecture series to help bridge this gap, exploring the differences between Eastern and Western Christianity. Pre-order the series now at the lowest price that will ever be offered, or support my efforts by becoming a series producer at theeastwestseries.com. That's theeastwestseries.com.